Inexorably, the one-year anniversary of Russia's invasion of Ukraine will come and go later this month. That will happen amid increased support from Western powers led by U.S. military aid and an anticipated surge from Russian forces. Where is the public support in the West on this, and will it hold? With us for their insights, let's welcome, in Washington, D.C., Elbridge Colby. He is the author of The Strategy of Denial, American Defense in an Age of Great Power Conflict. He's also co-founder and principal at the Marathon Initiative think tank. In our nation's capital, Joan DeBartoleben, Carleton University Chancellor's Professor and Jean Monnet Chair in Politics and Society in Russia and the European Union. And here in our studio, Seva Gunitsky, Associate Professor of Political Science at the University of Toronto. Seva, it's good to have you back in that chair. Elbridge and Joan, glad to have you on the line in the two capital cities of our two countries. Let's start this discussion by putting some numbers up here on some public opinion research, and then we'll get you all to comment on this. This is the most recent numbers of public support for Ukraine, polling done among 13 Western countries. So let's put this up, Sheldon, if we can. People were surveyed on whether they agree with restrictions on Russian oil and gas imports and that it's important to maintain those restrictions even if we must limit heating this winter. And 67% agreed with that, including Canada, 64% in the United States. High level of support. Second question, do you favor continuing to support Ukraine until all Russian forces have completely withdrawn? A little less support, 57%, the average for the 13 Western countries, 57% in the United States as well. One more question, do you favor providing weapons and air defense systems to the Ukrainian military? And here the support is less, 48% supporting that in the Western countries, a little more in the United States, 54%. Those numbers courtesy of Ipsos research from January of this year. Okay, Elbridge Colby, get us into this. About a year into this war, weeks away, we're told, from a new Russian offensive. How do you gauge that level of support for the war in Ukraine and for supporting Ukraine in that war?
Well, thanks, Steve. Great to be with you. I mean, I think it's been impressive that the level of support has been sustained. I think the numbers that you show are significant a year in. That said, I do think we see indicators, at least here in the United States, of slipping support, especially as the war. I mean, the U.S. administration, other sources, including NATO Secretary General Stoltenberg and others, are indicating the war is likely to become protracted and is unlikely to have a decisive outcome. Anything is possible, but I think the trend lines are towards more skepticism.
Joan DeBartoleben, how do you infer those numbers?
Well, I'm looking more at the numbers for Europe, and there I see various levels of support in different countries. And again, there is a bit of softening almost everywhere. But still, in most countries of the EU, there's more people, significantly more people, supporting the war and the various measures than there are opposing it, with a few exceptions. And one of those that was included in the Ipsos poll would be Italy, and skeptics also in countries like Hungary, somewhat more soft positions in countries like Bulgaria and Slovakia, which have close ties in the energy field, some of those countries in particular. But still, overall, and especially at the leadership level, I think this is very significant. With the exception of Hungary, European support is pretty solid.
Seva Gunitsky, I wonder if I could get you to compare and contrast those numbers with what you see coming out of Russia and how much support there is for the war against Ukraine in that country.
Right. Well, the numbers in Russia should be taken with a big grain of salt because clearly people answering those surveys are under some pressure to answer correctly if a person calls them, even if the person claims to be from a private organization. So support for the war, at least when it comes to public surveys, remains very strong in Russia. And Putin has taken steps to militarize not just society, but public media, and everything is now related to the war. So the country is steeped in the war, and Putin is hoping that he will play a long game where support will continue at a high level.
Elbridge, it is said that Putin expected Europeans to cave in to an energy embargo. That has not come to pass. Is he still expecting European support, do you suppose, to keep inching or dwindling downwards?
Yeah, I think we need to look at this in the context of the battlefield, which is, I don't think that my impression is that Putin does not assess, at least at this point, that he is going to cause a collapse of the Ukrainian Western position through economic sanctions alone. Rather, I assume what he's planning for is to gain advantage on the battlefield and then basically erode Western willpower sufficient to allow those gains to be locked in. Likewise, I think from our perspective in the West and in Europe, it's not, the economic sanctions against Russia, at least thus far, have not seemed to have had a very significant effect. The Russians have mobilized their economy. Actually, the most recent information out of the IMF is that the Russian economy actually grew last year. Yeah, they were coming out of COVID and so forth, but still, that's a pretty far cry from what we expected. There's been a huge adaptation of trade and commercial flows away from Europe towards China, India, Central Asia, Turkey, for instance. So I think what's really going to be determinative here, most likely, I mean, we never know, is the course of the battlefield and then how that interacts with support in the West and in Russia, of course, as well. But thus far, we don't see any slackening of any meaningful or material slackening in Russian popular support in a way that we could detect or would be meaningful.
Let me follow up on that with both Joan and Seva in this regard. How important do you think it is for decision makers in Western countries in terms of their flowing military support to Ukraine, that there is still a relatively high level of public support for those positions? Joan, why don't you start?
Well, of course, in any democratic polity, and this is where it's different from Russia, of course, public opinion is important because it can affect the fate of political leaders, especially if there are elections coming up. So it is something that the political leadership definitely has to pay attention to. However, I just make two comments. First, many countries have recently had elections, fairly recently anyway. The elections are not forthcoming soon, so that kind of immediate political pressure isn't there, and that would apply to countries like Germany and France, as well as some of the skeptic countries like Italy, where there was some concern that after the most recent election, which brought a right-wing government into power, that there would be a softening on Ukraine, which there in fact hasn't been. So that's one factor. And the second is that foreign policy rarely plays the primary role in elections. Other issues tend to go to the top of the agenda. Now, of course, that can happen. It can happen that the foreign policy issues become more important if they're highly contested by elites from different political parties. So it's important the degree to which the opposition in democratic countries makes this an issue. And so far, we haven't seen that to a large extent, but it certainly could arise, and that could raise more problems if public opinion wavers for governments.
Right. Seva, maybe you could build on that in this regard. Are Western powers so committed to Ukraine that even if there were a significant dip in public support for the war, they'd still keep doing what they need to do?
Yeah, I think public support does matter, but the U.S. especially and Europe as well have shown that they're willing to commit forces, material long term. And some of the softening of public support is to be expected. Partly attention drifts elsewhere to domestic issues. Partly it's that people expect results right away. We're giving Ukraine all this money. Why isn't Russia broken up yet? That kind of thing. And of course, that's why the prospect of a stalemate undermines support. And that's why the Ukrainian counteroffensive in the fall was very important for mobilizing support. But I think a lot of it, at least in the U.S., has to do with negative partisanship as well.
Meaning what?
Meaning the logic becomes, well, if everything, including gas stoves, is a partisan issue, then the logic becomes, look, Biden supports Ukraine. We don't support Biden, therefore we don't support Ukraine. So I don't know if there's a lot of thought behind that kind of reflexive partisanship, but it's there. And of course, underlying all that, again, at least in the US, is this reactionary isolationism that truly does, perhaps in some way, want Russia to win or admires Putin in some way, admires his project of alternative to the liberal order and wants to see him succeed in the same way that some of the isolationists in the 1930s wanted to succeed and admired Mussolini and Hitler for some of the same reasons.
I'm tempted to ask a follow-up question to Elbridge about how gas stoves became a partisan issue in his country, but I'm going to forgo that right now because it's a little off the path. But let's try this, Elbridge, instead. A recent survey shows that 40% of Republican voters think the U.S. is giving too much aid to Ukraine. At the beginning of the war, that number was 9%. It's now 40%. How do you see different wings of the grand old party dealing with this question of how and whether to support Ukraine?
Well, the reason gas stoves became an issue is because there were genuine fears that the administration was going to move towards banning them, and they are being banned in several parts of the United States. So those fears were well-grounded, and the administrations had moved off it for the time being. I think the characterization that the professor made of the American, conservative and Republican position is just flat out wrong, honestly, and I just fundamentally disagree with it. Obviously, there are elements in the country that sympathize with Putin and so forth. But the fundamental position is that, Senator Vance laid out in an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal is a real skepticism about the so-called forever wars. The United States is tired after decades of hyper-interventionism in pursuit of kind of, Francis Fukuyama type end of history, George W. Bush end to evil. Canada has not been as involved in these, but the American people have been, and we're pretty tired. And the United States has already done a lot more, well more than other countries, including Canada and Germany and so forth. So I think it's very important to bear that in mind. And the part of what has powered this political movement over the last few years is asking, after all of these efforts and all of these conflicts, what do we have to show for it? Actually, we're in worse shape. And the most fundamental reason why there's increasing skepticism about, sort of an unchecked kind of blank check approach to supporting the war in Ukraine. And to be clear, I do believe we should support the Ukrainians. But the primary risk to that is it is inhibiting and undermining our ability to pivot towards what is the world's most important theater, which is Asia, and by far our most significant threat, which is China, which is 10 times the GDP of Russia. And, we've just had a weather balloon float over not only the United States, but Canada as well, essentially brazenly. And that's just, of course, that's a sort of a political story and something that's grabbed the attention, but it shows something, it highlights something very fundamental, which is that China's been undertaking an unprecedented historic military buildup. And it's becoming increasingly clear as our defense industrial base is inadequate for the world that we're living in, that we are not prepared for that conflict. We are not adequately prepared. And that is the fundamental reason. And the administration has said that we can walk and chew gum at the same time, but there's greatly increasing skepticism, and not from the so-called, I object to the term isolationism and so forth. I think that's tendentious and so forth. But, the more kind of main, quote unquote, traditional or what have you type of Republicans. Senator John Cornyn, who's in leadership in the Republican Party in the Senate, very astutely and clear-headedly and in a clear-eyed way laid out the problems that we face in an event at the American Enterprise Institute a couple of weeks ago. So this is the reality. And the fundamental problem is, if we're going to be realistic, this war is likely to go on, and the Europeans, and I suppose Canada, but particularly Europe, is going to need to take the primary burden. The United States already allocated over $100 billion, far more than Europe, particularly in the case of military aid. And that cannot go on, because we have an acute threat in Asia, possibly 2027. We don't know, but it's a very real threat.
Let me get Seva to follow up on that. How problematic do you find the lack of support in huge chunks of the Republican Party to be towards the war's effort?
Well, first of all, I don't think we need to see support for Ukraine and support for Taiwan as mutually exclusive or zero-sum. The money that comes out to help Ukraine comes out of supplementary spending. It's not taking money away from fighting China or potentially fighting China. But also, what better way to demonstrate to China that nuclear-backed territorial aggression will not be tolerated by the West? What better way to credibly demonstrate it than by ensuring Russian defeat in Ukraine? To demonstrate to China, and I think it already has, that this is not going to be something easy that they can do. So I think there is a real threat, and it is immediate, and there's ways we can deal with it without abandoning Ukraine. And I think there's ways to mobilize American foreign policy in a way that supports both American values and American interests without having to compromise.
Sure,
go ahead. Could I respond to that, Steve?
Please.
I'm sorry. We spend 3.5% of our income on defense. That's far lower in other countries in Europe and Canada. The United States already spent over $100 billion. I'm sorry, but money is zero-sum. It can only be allocated one place, not another. And we are already facing very serious concerns about the size of our debt, about the size of the deficit, et cetera. We're potentially heading into a recession. So money is, in fact, scarce. And it is, the notion that the Chinese are looking primarily at the military balance in the Western Pacific. They're not, in fact, in a lot of ways, they benefit from the conflict in Ukraine, which has distracted the United States. It's refocused us on Europe. Look, and don't take it from me, Stephen Erlanger of the New York Times wrote a piece about how the Europeans are not stepping up and how this is inhibiting American ability to refocus on Asia. And by the way, the Russians have become more dependent on the Chinese. So the notion this is not zero-sum is just belied by the facts. The fact is that the United States, under two successive administrations, the Trump administration and the Biden administration, has said we don't have a military capable of fighting two wars simultaneously. And we're not acting like that. And this is a very real problem. And to dismiss it as if we're going to demonstrate to China they can't succeed in Taiwan, that's the kind of analogy that people use to support the war in Vietnam. Just to be clear, I'm not saying we should abandon Taiwan. That's a canard. I'm sorry. What I'm saying is that the Europeans and others need to take primary responsibility, and the United States needs to take a more supporting role so it can focus on Asia.
Joan, you want to weigh in on that?
Well, I think one should bring NATO into this because, of course, NATO, it's not just the U.S., it's also NATO. And we have to, emphasize that this is a very important issue for the viability of NATO. Now, of course, American support for NATO is essential, and Europeans recognize that. And especially as you get closer to the Russian border, there's more of a turn toward NATO than there is toward the EU for security defense. And I think there's no doubt that if American resolve wanes substantially, that will have the impact, probably not of cementing a stronger capability of the EU or of Europe to respond, but will undermine the whole venture. So I think it is critical that American resolve remains strong. The European Union is an entity that doesn't have foreign policy competence without agreement of all of the member states. And so it's a much more complicated decision-making structure. And none of the states in Europe, the strongest ones being France and Germany, would have the capability, no matter how many resources they tried to commit to it in the current situation, to handle this crisis alone. And of course, Germany, with its history, is reluctant to take on a leading military role. We saw that in the recent discussion about the tank delivery approvals, where Germany really looked to the United States to act in concert with it. So I think it's naive to think that Europe can handle this problem alone.
Well, let me stay with you for, yeah, Joan, if I can, let me, since you mentioned Germany, let me put the comments of the Chancellor to you, where he recently said that the Russian attack on Ukraine represented a historical shift, or a Zeitenwende, as he called it in Germany. Do you sense that the European world has accepted this as an historical shift in time?
Yes, I do. I think there's been a definite paradigm shift, whereas previously the Europeans placed hope on, their own founding principle, which was that through economic cooperation and interdependence, primarily energy interdependence with Russia, that they could bring Russia around to the liberal world order. And Germany continued to try to believe in that until quite recently. But the attack last February on Ukraine, I think, dashed that hope. And there's been a fundamental paradigm shift where it's accepted that, at least in the current moment, Russia has become a kind of adversary. Now, however, this doesn't mean that Germany is ready then to embrace itself as a military power. Germany's history makes it, imposes upon that country a sense of responsibility to not take a leadership role in the military sphere. And, that's not entirely unreasonable given how other countries might react. So without the American leadership, it's going to be difficult for countries like Germany to maintain the same level of resolve and capability. So I think the American resolve is very important here. And I think that President Biden recognizes that. The bigger question will be how the Republicans deal with it. If this war is still going on, at the time of the next election, presidential election in the U.S., of course, that would be a potential issue.
Right. All right. Tom Friedman of the New York Times usually has interesting and provocative things to say about the state of the world. And here is an excerpt from his column on February 5th, which I'd like to get into some discussion about here. Putin is basically saying to Biden, I can't afford to lose this war, and I will pay any price and bear any burden to ensure that I come away with a slice of Ukraine that can justify my losses. Friedman goes on to write, how about you, Joe? How about your European friends? Are you ready to pay any price and bear any burden to uphold your liberal order? Very Kennedy-esque language there. Okay, Elbridge, what do you think?
Well, I think it's apropos because that language comes from John F. Kennedy's inaugural address, which led us into Vietnam. And I think, look, the reality is that apropos of the comments just made, unfortunately, I think the naive view is that the United States is going to go on like this forever because we cannot do that. I don't question whether President Biden thinks that way. I think President Biden, frankly, thinks of Russia in a lot of ways as more of a threat than China, despite what he and many in his administration say. In fact, I think many in his administration do think that China is the priority threat. But also, let's bear in mind, again, I mentioned the 3.5%. There is opposition even within the Republican conference to increasing defense spending whatsoever. There's very little appetite in this country for another forever war or for dramatic increases in defense spending. And I think what's naive is to think that the Europeans can essentially continue along the current path. And I'd just like to say about Germany, because Germany is especially important. European countries are indeed capable of doing more. Look at Poland, which is increasing its spending to 5%. Germany was fully prepared during the existence of West Germany to have a very large military. In fact, it was the most formidable military in NATO except the United States itself. It has no problem being a military power when its own independence and security is at risk. It is failing to follow through on its Zeitenwende commitments. It's well below 2%. This is inexcusable. The Germans need in particular to take the lead. They are the backbone of a potential European response. If we in the United States, if we allow the Germans, as Stephen Erlanger and others, Liana Fix at the Council on Foreign Relations have pointed out, if we let this dynamic go, nobody is going to benefit. Here's the reality. Nobody, least of all the Ukrainians and the Europeans, because here's the reality. We are going to have to pivot to Asia at some point because the Chinese are too strong and the risk of an invasion is so real. If we have neglected to do that and prepare with our European allies together beforehand, it will happen and it will be very sudden, and there will be tremendous vulnerabilities to the Russians. So better for us to change the way that we do things in order to protect European security in a way that's more sustainable.
Seva, do you believe that the European Union is prepared to pay any price, bear any burden, in the way that Putin clearly has demonstrated that he is?
They've shown improvement, but it doesn't seem like they're willing to commit that much or to go that far. But I want to come back to that Friedman quote. I found it interesting because he seems to be saying that, look, Russia has escalation dominance, therefore Biden should tread carefully, and the next year will be very ugly, et cetera. But the thing is, Putin has set himself up for the long game. He knows he might not win next month or even next year, and he's ready for that. And if that's the case, if he believes that Russia's there in the long run and that this will favor Russia, then there's no reason to escalate very quickly. He's going to keep applying pressure, and he's going to wait for Western aid and European aid to decrease or decline, levels of support decline, and he'll keep putting pressure on the country. And therefore, I think Friedman is being a little bit alarmist there in claiming that Putin has this desire to escalate by whatever means necessary. All he has to do is keep applying pressure, and he thinks that will get him what he needs in the long run.
Well, Joan, let me put to you the comments of the UN Secretary General, who said recently, "I fear the world is not sleepwalking into a wider war. I fear it is doing so with its eyes wide open." Agree or disagree?
I think there's quite an awareness of the risks that are involved in this conflict, but also what's at stake. So there has been a careful calibration of the Western response. I think there's actually been a careful calibration on all sides, to this point at least. Despite the threats coming out from Putin, he really hasn't escalated in the way that he has suggested he might. Now, whether he'll continue that way, I don't know. On the Western side, of course, there's been a very careful attempt to avoid bringing NATO or bringing any NATO countries directly into the conflict. And I think this is very well understood, that this is a significant risk. Whether it's inevitable or even likely that this is going to lead to such an escalation, I think is not at all clear. I mean, certainly Putin to this point has not used the strongest options that he thinks he might, and seems to have we'll see what happens in this offensive, but the indications are it's going to be a ground war offensive. And on that point, I think how that goes is also going to affect public opinion and affect Western resolve. So if things go well for Ukraine in this coming spring, and the new military equipment that's been provided actually gives them the upper edge and they can push back Russia, I think that may embolden resolve among many people in Europe, although it may also lead others to think that this is the time to go to the negotiating table, something that the Hungarian prime minister has already said. So there may be an increasing kind of polarization or disagreement about the appropriate response. If, on the other hand, Russia shows greater success in this expected spring offensive, that could also undermine the confidence that some Western supporters have in the capability of Ukraine to prevail. So I don't think we should take our eye off the fact that what happens in the war actually affects public opinion very substantially, and that right now, going back to your question, Western governments are trying to make the outcome of this spring situation the most favorable to Ukraine to prevent that further erosion of resolve and confidence.
Okay, to that end, then we've got just about a minute to go here, and Elbridge, let me put this to you. I wonder which is the greater reason for why the West at the moment is supporting Ukraine as much as it is? Is it empathy for the Ukrainian people and what they're going through, or is it more a defense of the liberal democratic order in the world, which it feels the need to come to the rescue of? What say you?
Well, I think in the United States, it's probably more of the former. I mean, obviously, progressives are more enamored of the latter. I don't think that's sustainable or really in America's national interests. I think a lot of the support, including among Republicans, for the Ukrainians stems from sympathy for people fighting for their independence against brazen aggression. So I think that is the sort of, and one of the things that's so important that what the Ukrainians have done is not only their cause is just, but they've fought incredibly sort of resolutely and in very tough way. So I think that elicits support and will continue to elicit support.
I want to thank the three of you for coming onto our program tonight to talk about just the most dangerous neighborhood in the world as it comes up to the first anniversary of this terrible war. Elbridge Colby, Marathon Initiative. The Strategy of Denial is his latest work, American Defense in an Age of Great Power Conflict. Joan DeBartoleben, Professor of Political Science, Carleton University. She's the Chancellor's Professor there, the Jean Monnet Chair of Politics and Society in Russia and the European Union. And here in our studio, Seva Gunitsky, Associate Professor, Department of Political Science, University of Toronto. My thanks to the three of you. Appreciate your time very much.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.